so powerful together just to affirm that we are putting our trust in Jesus. And that's so powerful because the scriptures even tell us that in this life, we don't get to walk by sight, we have to walk by faith. And so when we're gathered as God's people, when we voice our faith together, there is something so powerful that transacts in that moment. Because we're agreeing together with God that Jesus is enough for us today. He's enough for the struggles that we're carrying into this room. He's enough to cover our past, and He's enough to trust for our future. And that's powerful to sing that together. Well, I could not be more excited this morning. We are taking the next step in the series that we're in called It's Not Over. And It's Not Over is all about coming back from life's most difficult circumstances. As we've gone through this series, it's just been incredible because we've opened up some of the things that we think are the hardest things life can throw at us. And what we found is that God's grace is sufficient to speak healing and life into all of those things. We talked about at the beginning of the series, the reality that we all resonate to some level with comeback stories, don't we? We love comeback stories. We love them because if for there to be a comeback story, there first had to be some significant pain, and we all relate to the pain because that's part of the human journey. And we all love comeback stories, secondly, because when we see somebody who's had kind of life's worst put on them and they turn it into something good, we start to believe that if that happened for them, it might possibly happen for us too. So we connect with these stories at a really deep level, whether it's a relational story, a social story, a sports story. I was hoping for a 12th round comeback story from Manny Pacquiao to get to share with you today. Didn't happen, but we still love Manny. I still love Manny. I'm not going to put that on LifeBridge, but I'm a fan of him. But the truth is, when you start to look at comeback stories and then you start to look at the scriptures, what you find very, very quickly is that the idea of coming back from adversity is like a thread that just runs all the way through the Bible. And what you find is people, ordinary men and women who get pushed to the very edge of their existence, begin to trust in God, and as long as God is still in the story, it's not over for them. And kind of the centerpiece of all that is Jesus himself. And we talked the first week about a story of Jesus, and he said this in John chapter 11. He said, I am the resurrection and the life. It's as though he was saying that as long as I'm in the picture, it's not over. Because as long as I'm in the picture, death isn't even strong enough to keep people away from me. It's not over if I'm in the story. Jesus' presence literally speaks, it's not over. And as we think about this series, it is so much more than just messages for our church. I want to go out and say, this is literally who we are as a church. If you've been around LifeBridge for any amount of time, you know we are not a church that just wants to gloss over the pain and the difficulty of life. And in this series, we've already looked at regret, but we've said we also believe in the power of forgiveness. We've looked at dealing with loss in our lives, but we have found comfort and hope in God's eternal promises. Last week, Rick talked about addiction, but we have found that it is the truth of Jesus that can set us free. And today, we're going to take that same lens and shine it on this problem called rejection. And rejection is a big deal thing for us as human beings. And we believe that the promises of God can speak into this. And so if you think about rejection this way, it's something that all of us have experienced at some level in our past, maybe right now, or going to experience in the future. I don't mean a harbinger of bad tidings, but we're going to experience rejection in this life. And rejection is just simply that feeling or that reality that goes down when we wanted to hear a yes and we got a no. When we so longed to be included, but we weren't included. When we feel marginalized or minimized or passed over or ignored or not invited when everybody else seemed to have a party to go to and we didn't. And it can happen in every single sphere of life. It happens in our homes. It happens in our workplaces. It happens on the athletic field like crazy. It happens all over this world, every sphere, and it can be gigantic, flat-out rejection. I'm not living with you anymore. We're not doing this anymore. You're not working here anymore. Or it can just be that incremental rejection, those words of rejection that accumulate in the storehouse of our heart and give us that feeling of being inferior or inadequate. It happens in all kinds of ways. I started to think about rejection in my own life this week, and it took me some places, and I ended up with like a file about this big of like all the stories of times I got rejected in my life in some way, shape, or form. And the one I want to share with you today, just a memory I recalled recently, was when I was in high school. And I was a track athlete in high school. I wanted to play quarterback, but there's reasons. And I ended up being a track athlete. And I ran distance, and I ended up being a pretty fast runner. In my senior year, I had not lost a race in the 2-mile. And so my parents, huge supporters of me. My dad had, the VCR camcorder that some of you may have had that was like the size of that television down there. I mean, one of those gigantic things that you needed a cart to push around or you'd get arm surgery if you held it for too long. And he would come to the races and videotape the races. And I was often on the front page of our little local Tiffin, Ohio newspaper about Ramin Razavi doing something in running. And this all building towards the state meet my senior year, which is in the hallowed grounds of the Horseshoe at The Ohio State University, getting to run on the Jesse Owens Memorial Track. And I qualify for the 2-mile, and coming into the race, I'm seated, I believe, 6th in the state. And I'm thinking, I got to find a way to win this thing. So I watch the movie about Steve Prefontaine, the night before the race. I don't know if you've seen this movie. It's about one of America's greatest distance runners ever. And when he was in the Olympics, he was pretty much guaranteed a medal slot if he just ran up to his ability. But he took the lead with 2 laps to go and ended up fading to 4th place. And I watched the video, and I didn't kind of pay attention to the fading to 4th place part. I just paid attention to the taking the lead part of the story. And so we get out on the track, and it's near the end of the day. It's kind of at the end of the meet, and I'm sitting comfortable 4 laps into the 2-mile. I'm right on pace, clicking along, and I get to 2 laps, 800 meters to go, and I come out to lane 2, and I take the lead of the state meet, 3,200 meters. And I'm blazing. I mean, I feel like the wind has shifted to my back. My form is smooth. My breathing is regulated. People are falling behind me. And that went on for about 150 meters. And then it felt like every single animal on a National Geographic special jumped on my back, like all at the same time. And the head starts going back, the arms start going back. I'm going from 4 25-mile pace to 6 25-mile pace. And all of a sudden, blurs of color start going by me in this cacophony of sound. And I end up coming across the finish line in the glorious position of 9th place. And I walk over, and I'm just crushed. I mean, this is my whole life. Everything in my life was about track and field at that point in my life. And I walk over, and I see my coach, and he kind of pats me on the back, and I'm going over to my parents, and I'm just looking for what they're going to say. And I'll never forget this. My dad's got that gigantic camcorder on his shoulder, and he looks at me, and he just asks the question. He says, "Why did you do that?" And I did what you did. I kind of chuckled too. But inside, it felt like somebody was turning a dagger in my heart. And I can tell you the truth that years later, whenever I had an athletic kind of failure, I could hear my dad's voice in my head. Why did you do that? Because all I needed in that moment was just some acceptance. With somebody coming at me saying, "Son, you're 9th in the state. You've accomplished a lot. You got a lot more races ahead of you, son. You got a bright future ahead of you." But it was that question that just kind of opened a cavern in my heart and kind of exposed the inferiority that I already thought I might have because of my performance and the embarrassment that I felt like I had been in front of 20,000 screaming fans. And it just kind of poured fuel on this fire of embarrassment, inferiority, and rejection. And the truth is, that is a story about a high school kid running a track meet. It's not really that big of a deal, but the truth is you can take that up to whatever level you need to take that up when it comes to rejection. Because that very well could be the story of what you've heard from your family. It could be the story of what you've heard from your parents. It could be what you hear from your children. It could be what you've heard from coworkers. It could be what you heard from the career that you thought was going to be what you did for the rest of your life until you got that slip of paper that said you're not welcome here anymore. It could have been those words from that social circle that you so longed to be in, but you didn't get invited, or you heard the rumor of how they really felt about you, or you overheard a conversation. It could get taken up to any level it needs to, because the reality is rejection cuts our heart in half because it cuts away the thing that we need the most in life, which is acceptance. Acceptance. Psychologists tell us that is the leading human motivation is acceptance, the drive for it. We'll do almost anything for it. It's why sometimes we can't figure out why somebody's hanging out with somebody. It's because they accept them. Or why maybe our kids hang out with a certain person we don't think they should hang out with. It's like because they are getting acceptance there. It is the base level drive, and psychologists tell us that when we get rejected, the same area of our brain that fires when you break your arm fires when you get rejected. The pain of rejection is very real. And we've got to find a way to come back from it through the power and through the grace of God. And what's encouraging for us in that is that when you start to read the stories of the Bible, and people that God used in significant ways, I was just seriously blown away this week as I studied Scripture, because I could not hardly find a significant person in the Bible who was not first exposed to rejection before God used them in a great way. And so in a hilarious way, I actually ended up writing like 3 sermons for this sermon, and I promise I won't preach them all. But I mean, Jesus was rejected in some major ways. Jeremiah the prophet was rejected in major ways. Joseph was rejected in major ways. Moses was rejected in some pretty serious and major ways. But we're going to take some time and look at the life of King David this morning. Because King David stands as kind of this figure in the Old Testament of this mighty ruler, this king, this leader, who the people of God would say was a man after God's own heart. I mean, that's a pretty awesome epitaph to carry. You're a man after God's own heart. And he had this incredible influence on the history of the nation of Israel, and actually the history of the world, historians will tell us. But what we don't often recognize is that before David moved into some of those spaces of prominence and influence, he experienced a tremendous amount of rejection when he was young. And what we're going to do today is just take a look at King David's story, and I really believe that as we look at his story, God will show us how his acceptance for us, God's acceptance for us, is stronger than the sting that we might feel from human rejection. So as we get started in David's story, I just want to share a few thoughts about him personally. David was coming on the scene around 1000 BC. It was a real pivotal moment in the history of the nation of Israel. They had begun to ask for a king. They wanted a physical king, not just God as their king. And so he gave him a king called Saul. Saul was a good king for just a really little short period of time, and then his heart turned away from God. And so they're in this process of trying to figure out who's going to be the next king, and a prophecy or word from God comes down to the prophet Samuel, and it's like, okay, there's this guy called Jesse, and Jesse's a righteous man, and one of Jesse's sons is going to be the next king of Israel. Well, Jesse had 8 sons. So there's going to have to be a moment where they figure out which son is actually the next king of Israel. Jesse had 7 sons that were all pretty close in age, and then Jesse's wife became pregnant, and there were actually some curious circumstances surrounding the pregnancy. I don't have time to go into all of it, but the historians tell us that Jesse, for a little while, wasn't 100% confident that David was actually his kid. And so what Jewish historians tell us is that David got treated really differently than the rest of his brothers. This is corroborated by Psalm 69. You can take a look at that sometime. But David got treated really differently by his parents and differently than the rest of his brothers. And historians tell us that David was even assigned the role of being a shepherd, which we know him as a shepherd, because they were somewhat hoping that as he was out there defending the sheep against lions and bears, he might just get written off right there. And so he was seen as expendable. He was an expendable child in the family. And he was one who, when he came back from being a shepherd, the historians tell us he was even assigned a different table to eat at than his brothers. He wouldn't eat in the home with his brothers. This is also in Psalm 69, this idea. And what we pick up with the story of David is that early in his life, David is experiencing this rejection, human rejection, from the very place that we need acceptance from the jump, and that's our own families. And some of us have experienced that. We know what that feels like. We can relate to David, know what it's like to be seen as expendable, someone who's treated differently. Maybe not because of anything we even did, but just because of the decision of other people. And so David is dealing with this, and we pick up the story, 1 Samuel 16. Samuel the prophet is coming to this moment where he's going to help select which of the sons of Jesse is actually the next king of Israel. So here we go. When they arrived, Samuel saw Eliab. That's the oldest brother in the family, so he's pretty stout here. And thought, surely the Lord's anointed stands here before the Lord. But the Lord said to Samuel, do not consider his appearance or his height, for I have rejected him, Eliab. The Lord does not look at the things man looks at. Man looks at the outward appearance. Man gets really caught up with what is physical, what's exterior, what we can see. But the Lord looks at the heart. Then Jesse called Abinadab and had him come pass in front of Samuel. But Samuel said, the Lord has not chosen this one either. Jesse then had Shammah pass by, but Samuel said, nor has the Lord chosen this one. He's run out of sons. Jesse had 7 of his sons pass before Samuel, so it's like the showcase showdown. But Samuel said to him, the Lord has not chosen these. So he asked Jesse, are these all the sons you have? Kind of hiding in there in what's not said is somebody didn't get invited to the party. He's like, I got 7. It's got to be one of these. These are the ones I'm proud of. These are the ones that are tall and strong and accomplished and maybe have the right friends and do the right things and look the right way and kind of say the right things that reflect well on the family. These are the ones I'm proud of. Can you pick one of the ones that I would like to reflect back on me, Jesse is saying. And Samuel is like, don't you have another son? And Jesse comes back and he doesn't even say his name. I mean, he's just, the scriptures are real clear. There is still the youngest. As in, like, well, I guess, yeah, there's the guy that we put out on the backside of the hill, and we kind of secretly hoped that one of the wild animals would take him out so we didn't have to deal with him. But yeah, there's that guy. Yeah, we got him. Do you want us to go get him? Send for him. He will not sit down until he arrives. It's pretty important. So he sent and had him brought in. He was ruddy. It just means he was kind of red complexion. If you're a ginger, this is a good moment for you. He was ruddy, with a fine appearance and handsome features. He's a good-looking kid. Then the Lord said, rise and anoint him. He is the one. The Lord said that. God said, I put in my approval. That's what anoint was. They just put oil on people's heads. It was a way of saying God approves of this person in a pretty significant way. So anoint him, approve of him. This is the one. So Samuel took the horn of oil and anointed him in the presence of his brothers. So everybody saw what was going down. And from that day on, the Spirit of the Lord came upon David in power. And Samuel then went to Ramah. And so David has grown up experiencing all of this rejection. He's sitting there on the side of the hill watching over the sheep, and he gets message that you need to come back because there's this moment of significance, big moment that you need to be carried into because Samuel's picking somebody from your family to be the next king of Israel. And David just kind of confidently comes into that moment. I don't know about you, but I may not have confidently come into that moment if that was me. And the question we have to ask is, how did David do that? How did he do that? Because he had he had a truckload of human rejection just dumped on him over and over and over again. And the thing that David believed and the thing that can be true for us by faith is that God's acceptance of us is stronger than the sting of human rejection. God's acceptance of us is stronger than the sting of human rejection. You know how we know this? David never got celebrated by his parents. We live in a culture right now, and if you look at my Twitter feed, it's like Isaiah did this, Isaiah accomplished this, he climbed this route, he won the soccer game, he did all these amazing things. We celebrate our kids like crazy, don't we? We love it. David never got that. He didn't have anybody saying, I'm proud of my son. He didn't have anybody. He was rejected by his parents in a pretty significant way, definitely his father. He was rejected by his brothers in a pretty significant way. And so where did David learn where to find his acceptance and his value? It was from God himself. David understood from the very beginning of his life that if we try to find our value in life from human acceptance, we're going to be sunk before we even start. And so look at Psalm 27. This is a psalm of David, written by David, giving us an insight into David's heart. He says, one thing I ask of the Lord. One thing. I've asked God for like 20,000 things, from the big deal things to the really little things. I've asked God for a lot of things. David's saying, here is the one singular thing that I really, really ask for from God. It's this, that I may dwell in the house of the Lord, and that all the days of my life, to gaze upon the beauty of the Lord and to seek him in his temple. He's saying the one desire I have is to be near to God. That's the one thing I need. Everything else I can deal without, but the one thing that I cannot live without is the presence and the acceptance and the love and the friendship of God. Why? Psalm 27:10, though my father and my mother forsake me, the Lord will receive me. David came into that moment, not like his brothers, looking for acceptance from some human voice, but he came into that moment loaded with acceptance from his heavenly Father. And that's the promise that we have from God too. To ask that question, what is our one thing? What is the one thing we ask? What is the one thing we seek from God? If we were to answer the question, what is it that defines your value in life? What is it that defines your value? Is it what people think of you? Is it your accomplishments? Is it the amount of money you've accumulated? Is it the car that you drove in here today? The neighborhood you live in? The place your kids got to go to school? Because what we find pretty quickly is those things don't really have the capacity to satisfy our souls over the course of a lifetime. And David offers us this other pathway and says you can come back from the flood of rejection that tries to come at you when you stand secure on the acceptance that comes from your Father in heaven. And that's how we begin to come back from rejection, as we believe that the acceptance of our Heavenly Father is greater than the sting of human rejection. The second thing that David helps us understand is that although rejection may be a very real part of our story, it is God who is the author of our story. And we see this as this anointing happens and he gets selected. He goes off with Saul, who's the current king, and a little situation goes down called the Philistines starting to invade the nation of Israel. And so what's going on is this army from the Philistines is coming, and there's these two hills. And on one hill is the nation of Israel, and on the other hill is the army of the Philistines. In the middle is the valley of Elah. And what the scriptures tell us is that the Philistines had this choice warrior, this champion called Goliath. We may have heard of Goliath. And Goliath would stride out 9 feet tall, makes Von Miller look like a midget, kind of steps to the front. And he starts taunting Israel every day, 40 days and 40 nights, just taunting the nation of Israel, saying, who's going to come? Who's coming at me? Who wants a piece of me? Who wants to come at Goliath? Who is willing to take me on for the pride of your nation? And Israel's just sitting like, you going to go? I'm not going to go. Anybody going to go? Who wants to volunteer? Any volunteers? Anyone want to go die? Who wants to be a part of the fight with Goliath? And David during this time, even though he's been anointed as the next king of Israel, his dad still has him watching the sheep. Hello. It's another little teaspoon of rejection. And he's got a job from Saul, and the job he has is to kind of be the Hungry Buff vehicle. Have you seen that? It drives around and delivers food, or Grubhub. He's delivering food to the front lines. He's bringing cheese, grain, and bread. That's his job. Watching sheep, delivering food. That's a great job description for a coming king. I don't know what they were thinking, but that's what he was getting. And so David comes into this moment where Goliath is taunting. It says early in the morning, 1 Samuel 17, David left the flock with a shepherd, loaded up, and set out as Jesse had directed him. So he's doing what his dad told. He reached the camp as the army was going out to the battle position, shouting the war cry. Israel and the Philistines were drawing up their lines facing each other. David left his things with the keeper of supplies and ran to the battle lines and greeted his brothers. I'm going to skip down to verse 28 now. What happens? Goliath is taunting. David says, I don't want to have any of that. And then when Eliab, David's oldest brother, heard David speaking with the men, he burned with anger at David and asked him, why have you come down here? And with whom did you leave those few sheep in the desert? I know how conceited you are and how wicked your heart is. You came down here only to watch the battle, David. I mean, you just feel the rejection just dripping out of those words. This poor kid, I mean, I have a little brother, Eli. He used to roll into whatever we were doing, so excited to see us. And if we would have done that to him, he would have run back to the house like in 2 seconds. The truth is, I would have been totally supportive of David if he said, you know what, Eliab, forget about you, forget about this army, you guys handle Goliath, I'm going back. And guess what? I'm already anointed as the next king, which means I'm going to get big and strong, and I'm going to have an army that's going to roll you in a few years. So I'm going to deal with you when the time comes, but good luck with Goliath, and I'm taking my bread and cheese with me back to the sheep. Like, I would have been like, cool, right? I mean, come on, how much rejection is one kid supposed to get? He gets it from his dad. He got it from all the brothers. He even got it a little bit from Samuel. He's gotten it from Saul. And now his big brother, the most significant male voice in his life apart from his dad, is dumping another truckload of rejection on David. But what does David do? He doesn't take it personally. In fact, I just reading in there, I just think what David believed was that rejected people end up rejecting people. And he knew his brother had a whole bunch to deal with because he hadn't gotten selected as king. And I think David knew that the rejection that was coming at him wasn't because there was anything wrong with David, but because there was a whole lot wrong with Eliab. And Eliab should have been celebrating his little brother, but because of jealousy in his life, was rejecting his little brother. And I'm telling you the truth, so many times in life, when we face rejection, it's not because of us, but it's the person doing the rejecting who's got a problem. It's because they've been rejected. They've been hurt. They've been left out. And so they carry all this negativity towards us, and we become a lightning rod for them to release that negative energy on. And we need to learn like David did. And we're standing on the acceptance of God. That doesn't have to take us off course. We can move forward even though we're experiencing the rejection. So the story goes on, and now he comes before Saul, and he tells Saul, we got to deal with this giant. Verse 33, Saul says, you're not able to do this. Jiminy Christmas. And fight, you can't go fight him. You're only a boy. You're only a little boy. It's like Saul is saying to David, don't get your hopes up, kid. Stop thinking about these grand thoughts. Maybe just go get the cheese and the sheep and the cheese and the sheep and the cheese and the sheep. Stop thinking that your life can be more than it currently is. Let me just speak another confining word of rejection over you. Gets it from Saul. I love how David responds to him because there's something so powerful in this for us about seeing God as the author of our story. David tells him a little bit of his story. He says, guess what? Your servant has been keeping his father's sheep. Parenthetically, the reason I keep the sheep is I've been rejected most of my life. And when a lion or bear came and carried off a sheep from the flock, guess what? I went after it. I struck it and rescued the sheep from its mouth, and when it turned on me, I seized it by its hair, I struck it and killed it. I've slayed some animals. Your servant has killed both the lion and the bear, and this uncircumcised Philistine will be like one of them, because he's defied the armies of the living God. The Lord who delivered me from the paw of the lion and the paw of the bear will deliver me from the hand of this Philistine. What David was saying is, check this out. The rejection that happened in my past actually prepared me for this moment right now. And what it speaks into every one of our lives is that the rejection we may be experiencing in this very moment may just be the way that God is preparing us for a future role in his emerging story. And so when we're facing that rejection, David found that there was something for me in that rejection, and that's that I learned how to trust God to defeat enemies that were much more powerful than me. So now I already took out lions and bears by the power of God, thank you very much. So bring on a giant, because I know not that I have the ability, but I've learned because I went through rejection. I went through hardship. I went through a valley. I sat through darkness. I was alone. I felt marginalized. I felt left out, and I found that my God is stronger than those feelings. And now I'm going to take on this giant. So give me a slingshot. I don't need your sword. I don't need your armor. I've got my God on my side. And our experience of rejection can be the way that God is preparing us for a future role in his emerging story. So as we settle with those things and we move forward from this place today, it's one little thing I want to leave us with, a thought, inspiration, is that we have to know where our help comes from in the middle of all this. I love the way that David writes about it in Psalm chapter 8. He was a young boy when he wrote this psalm, and he says, "O Lord, our Lord, how majestic is your name in all the earth." Just saying, you're the author, you're the one in control. He says, "And when I consider your heavens, the work of your fingers, the moon and the stars, which you've set in place." So I'm a shepherd. I'm looking out at the immensity of the night sky, the stars and the planets and all the celestial beings. I'm taking it all in. And a question comes into my mind. David says, "What is man? What am I that you're even mindful of me? Or the son of man that you even care for me?" I mean, he's just asking that question that we all ask. Is anyone mindful of me? And as he's in this moment, God speaks back to him and he says, "But I've crowned you with glory and honor. I've created you just a little bit less than the heavenly beings." He's saying, as I'm looking up at the night sky, what I find is that the eyes of my God are looking back at me and they're saying, "I'm with you in the night. I'm with you in the night." And even though your family and your friends and your people and your job and your neighborhood may have rejected you, I am mindful of you. You're on my mind, and I know every hair on your head, and if I were to count all the thoughts I have about you, they'd outnumber every grain of sand on the seashores. I'm mindful of you, David. He knew where his help came from. And even though David had to look up to the heavens, we even get a better promise, because in Jesus, the heavens have come to us. Hebrews tells us that we have a high priest who is not unable to sympathize. He is able to sympathize with our weakness, and we can approach him to find mercy and to receive grace in our time of need. And what he speaks through his mercy and grace is that you are not rejected. You are a son and you are a daughter of the living God.